Welcome to the webinar on working with persons with disabilities. I'm Dr. Kristen Jones. I serve as a Developmental Disability Program Specialist for Child Protective Services. In my role, I advise the department on services and supports available for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Hi, I'm Denise Brady. I'm a senior policy attorney at DFPS, focusing in large part on issues related to children in conservatorship and their medical and educational needs.
This webinar will be a refresher on information that you have already learned in CPD, but also touches on the updated policies and resource guide that have been included in the Meeting in a Box. Over the last year, CPS and CPI staff from state office and the regions, as well as disability rights advocates, worked together to review and make updates to CPS and CPI policies related to working with persons with disabilities. The policy updates affect CPS handbook sections 1000, 2000, and 5000. The resource guide entitled Working with Persons with Disabilities has undergone several updates to provide guidance as you approach your work and interaction with persons with disabilities. The resource guide includes background on federal legislation that affects the way the FPS works with individuals with disabilities, the population of people protected by the laws, how to know when a person has a disability and needs accommodations, what you should do differently when working with individuals with disabilities, specific type of accommodations and modifications, appropriate ways to speak and write about persons with disabilities, and federal, state, and local support for persons with disabilities. The drafts of the policy and resource guide have been included in your Meeting in a Box packet and will be fully published the first day of next month. All DFPS staff in all stages of service are required to follow the policy covered in this Meeting in a Box.
The Americans with Disabilities Act, referred to as ADA, was signed into law on July 26, 1990. The ADA is one of America's most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to participate in the mainstream of American life, to enjoy employment opportunities, to purchase goods and services, and to participate in state and local government programs and services. Title II of the ADA and other federal laws prohibits state and local government entities, such as DFPS, from discriminating against people with disabilities. An individual with a disability cannot be denied benefits or excluded from participation in a public entity's services, programs, or activities. It is imperative that DFPS staff treat all children and families equitably. At times, this may mean that DFPS must provide accommodations to ensure people with disabilities have equal opportunity to access services, to ensure safety, permanency, and well-being for the children and families we serve. We'll discuss accommodations and provide examples throughout this webinar.
Under the ADA, a person with a disability is an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the individual's major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such impairment. This means that anyone that has a diagnosed disability, a documented history of having a disability, or anyone that you believe may have an impairment must be accommodated within the confines of the ADA law. In the DFPS system, individuals with disabilities can include children, parents, relatives, fictive kin or other caregivers, foster and adoptive parents, and individuals seeking to become foster or adoptive parents. Examples of disabilities can include, but are not limited to, AIDS, blindness or other visual impairments, cerebral palsy, intellectual and or developmental disabilities, depression, diabetes, epilepsy, hearing or speech impairments, heart disease, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. If you are ever unsure if a person's condition qualifies as a disability, consult with your regional attorney or developmental disability specialist.
Let's take a minute to discuss why it is so important to properly identify persons with disabilities and ensure that they're appropriately accommodated. DFPS should ensure that anyone involved with the agency has full and equal opportunity. Full and equal opportunity requires that individuals with disabilities be provided opportunities to benefit from or participate in child welfare programs, services, and activities that are equal to those extended to individuals without disabilities. This principle means that aids, benefits, and services may need to be provided differently to a person with a disability in the DFPS system than how the service is provided to other parents and caregivers. DFPS needs to ensure that everyone involved in the DFPS system has the same opportunity to benefit from the services the department provides, even if accommodations must be made to ensure equitable treatment. For example, if a person with a learning disability has their children removed and is referred to parenting classes, it's the duty and responsibility of DFPS to ensure that the parent is taught parenting classes in a way that they can learn and understand the content of the classes. Simply referring a parent to formal classes in a classroom setting may not be enough. The content may need to be reinforced through one-on-one parenting training during extended visits or in additional therapy sessions. By making these accommodations in the service, you are taking the steps to ensure the parent has full and equal opportunity to learn the content that's being provided through the formal parenting classes. While arranging the services and making these accommodations may be more demanding on your time as a case manager, it assures that the parent has the opportunity to gain the knowledge and skills needed to properly care for their children. If a parent is not given equal opportunity to gain the skills and knowledge outlined in their service plans, reunification may be harder to achieve.
When an individual informs DFPS staff that they have a disability and need accommodations or assistance because of a disability, or staff has reason to believe the person has a disability that requires an accommodation, staff must work with the individual to determine what accommodations are required. The best source of information to determine if a client has a disability is by asking the client themselves. If the client receives community services from the local mental health authority or other service provider, they may also have information relating to diagnosed or suspected disabilities. If the client has received a recent psychological evaluation, their disabilities may be listed. If a person whom you suspect has a disability is a child, you may speak to the child's parent, kin, teachers, daycare, or other people that have regular contact with the child and first-hand knowledge of the child's diagnosed disabilities and needs. Staff must document the type of disability and modified service offered to the client and particularly note those services that involve reasonable accommodation of the person's disabilities. For example, if a client is deaf or hard of hearing and requires sign language interpretation services to assist in communication, staff must document the disability and the need for an interpreter in the case record. The staff must also ensure that an interpreter is utilized during each interaction with a client. Staff must update person characteristics and impact as needed to reflect the person's disability. In the same example, staff would check hearing impairment in the person characteristics page in impact and update the client's language to reflect sign language on the person's detailed page.
As you know, the court often appoints attorneys ad litem and guardians ad litem to children involved in a legal case with DFPS. When DFPS files a suit with the court to obtain custody of a child or to terminate parental rights, the court may appoint an attorney ad litem and a guardian ad litem to represent the child's interests. In some cases, the attorney ad litem and the guardian ad litem may be the same person. In all cases that require court intervention, when a parent has an intellectual or developmental disability or a mental illness, staff must seek legal consultation and request that an attorney ad litem be appointed for the parent. The request must be documented in the case file.
As an investigator or caseworker, you must assess the communication needs for each individual child and adult to determine if any accommodations need to be made for them. If you believe that the child or adult may have a communication disability or other disability, such as deafness, hearing loss, or autism spectrum disorder, which causes difficulty in communication, you must make appropriate accommodations in their interviewing process or other monthly contacts in order to gather the information needed to determine if abuse or neglect occurred, or to ensure adequate services for children and adults. Ask the individual what form of communication works best for them. Do not assume that a child or adult can lip read. Written communication is also not an effective form of communication in most cases. Utilizing family or friends to act as interpreters should only be used in an emergency situation and should not be relied upon as regular form of communication with the client. When a client is deaf and requires interpretation services, always use a certified interpreter. For some disabilities, such as autism, it may be more difficult to determine the most effective way to communicate with the individual. Conversations with the reporter, collateral contacts, family members, or school personnel may provide some guidance on how the child or adult communicates.
Auxiliary aids and services are devices or services that facilitate communication and access to services for a client with any type of disability. Examples of auxiliary aids and services include, but are not limited to, qualified interpreters, computer-aided transcription services, note takers, assistive listening devices, qualified readers, audio recordings, Braille materials, and large printed materials. DFPS and courts are required to take appropriate steps, including the provision of appropriate auxiliary aids and services where necessary to ensure that individuals with communication disabilities understand what is said or written and can communicate as effectively as individuals without disabilities. The type of auxiliary aid or service necessary to ensure effective communication is going to vary in accordance with the method of communication used by the individual with a disability, the nature, length, and complexity of the communication involved, and the context in which the communication is taking place.
Aside from communication accommodations, there are times that you may need to provide accommodations to other services. The goal is to provide reasonable service modifications to parents with disabilities so that the services are as effective as those provided to persons without disabilities in every stage of client services delivery. When applicable, use the Family Strengths and Needs Assessment and other SDM tools to identify needs that may require modified services for caregivers with disabilities to reduce the risk of child abuse and neglect. Whenever possible and applicable, address in service plans any modification of services needed to help parents who have disabilities prevent the removal of children from their home, and ensure that earliest possible return home for children in conservatorship when safety threat has been mitigated. For example, if a parent is diagnosed with an intellectual and/or developmental disability and is at risk of their children being removed due to concerns about home environment being dirty and limited skill in performing daily living activities, the caseworker should consider referring the parent to appropriate services in the community to assist them in obtaining the skills necessary for the child's ongoing care and well-being. A referral to the local intellectual and developmental disability authority could assist the client in obtaining community support services and prevent removal of the children from their home. Community support services are individualized activities that are provided in the person's home and at community locations such as libraries and stores. Supports may include habilitation and support activities that foster improvement of or facilitate the person's ability to perform daily living activities, and activities for the person's family that help preserve the family unit and prevent or limit out-of-home placements of the person. Some examples of modifications that can be used as part of service planning when a parent or caregiver has an intellectual or developmental disability or a mental illness include: provide a more intensive level of service, such as increase the frequency with which a service is provided, extend the length of time the service is provided, increase and repeat training and information as needed over an extended period of time, provide more extensive and thorough follow-up services. Also, provide services in a different way, such as modify staff counseling and client parenting skills training to provide more concrete, hands-on instruction in a natural environment. Provide a caseworker, relative, or community provider to model parenting skills to the parents in the family home. Provide reminders for appointments or services on a more frequent and intensive basis. Provide a calendar in which appointments are clearly identified, or provide step-by-step representation of reminders of tasks. If the client has transportation constraints, provide bus schedules or other options that inform the client of the address and/or routes to their service. When interacting with a client or child with disabilities, consider the disability when planning for or providing services, conducting investigative interviews, conducting monthly face-to-face contacts, and considering placements for youth. Examples of accommodations for persons with physical disabilities can include relocating a service to an accessible facility or portion of a building if the person has a mobility impairment. Services could also be provided at the individual's home. Referring a caregiver to agencies or services that may be able to provide an aid or personal assistant, a service animal, help with child care, supportive housing, or other supports. Arranging for or directly providing transportation to important meetings or hearings. When providing services to a child, consider the following examples. If the child is deaf or hard of hearing and uses sign language to communicate, attempt to find a placement that can communicate with the child. If the child has a physical disability and is in a wheelchair, attempt to find a placement that can accommodate the child's physical needs, such as wider doorways, or no physical barriers such as steps to enter the home. If the child has ADHD, consider the environment you are interviewing them in. If the child is in the conservatorship of DFPS, consider the child's potential need for a calm space for your quality face-to-face monthly visits.
We've discussed examples of accommodations relating to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing several times throughout this webinar. It's imperative that a client who has communication disabilities or impairments is able to effectively communicate throughout the entire life of the case. The best way to make sure this happens is by utilizing an interpreter. The ADA defines a qualified interpreter as one who is able to interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using any necessary specialized vocabulary. DFPS does not use family members or friends to interpret, translate, sign, or read for clients with disabilities or limited English proficiency, except at the client's specific request. Even if the client does make the request, DFPS staff should not use family members or friends for the purposes of assessing or communicating safety or service planning. Child victims must not be used as translators except for brief interaction to ascertain the client's request and/or arrange requested translation services. Ideally, interpreters and translators will be professionally trained or will be a DFPS staff person who is fluent in the client's preferred language. Victims, their family members, or friends rarely meet the impartiality requirements of a qualified interpreter as defined by the ADA. DFPS staff should not rely on an adult or child with the individual to interpret for a person with a hearing impairment, except in an emergency involving imminent threat to the safety or welfare of an individual or the public, where there is no interpreter available, or when the individual with a disability specifically requests that the accompanying adult interpret, facilitate communication. The accompanying adult agrees to provide such assistance, and relying on that adult is appropriate under the circumstances. Instances requiring interpreter services include, but are not limited to, interviews or any contacts with the client, face-to-face contacts, supervised visitation, permanency planning team meetings and other staffings, family group conferences, trainings and meetings involving adults who are deaf and are interested in becoming foster parents. DFPS staff may contact one of the contracted providers to request appropriately certified interpreters. DFPS and the Health and Human Services Commission, or HHSC, have an interagency contract that allows DFPS to work with HHSC sign language providers. This service used to be provided by DARS, the Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services. Only choose providers who appear on the interpreter list on the HHSC website and are located within the DFPS region where the service is needed. You must complete Form 2239 and provide the completed form to the regional liaison for your program to assist in service tracking. You can visit the Language Services Guide page on the DFPS intranet for instructions on requesting an interpreter and information on the regional liaisons. The link is on the slide. When a client requests an interpreter or other auxiliary aid or service, DFPS staff must document the request clearly in impact and include the need in any service plan throughout the life of the case. When using an interpreter, remember to look at the person who is deaf and recognize that they will not maintain eye contact while you're speaking because they will be looking at the interpreter. Speak to the client directly, not to the interpreter. Maintain normal speaking speed. Verify comprehension with the person who is deaf, and pay attention to nonverbal communication. DFPS staff are required to notify the court when interpretation services are needed in court. Courts are required to provide interpreter services for people who are deaf or hard of hearing during court hearings or other proceedings. Although the requirement to provide an interpreter applies to the court and not to DFPS, if the court has not indicated plans to provide an interpreter with the required certification, DFPS must request that the attorney representing the department notify the court of the requirement. The interpreter must hold a court interpreter certification from the Board for Evaluation of Interpreters or a Registry of Interpreters specialty certificate legal.
I know that we've covered a lot today relating to working with persons with disabilities. The examples and approaches that we shared today certainly don't address all of the disabilities that you may encounter when working with children and families on your workload. But don't worry, you have a great resource at your fingertips every day. All DFPS staff with an agency cell phone have access to the SAFE application. The SAFE application can help you with strategies to interact and communicate with youth that have disabilities, including communication disabilities, autism, intellectual or developmental disabilities, deaf or hard of hearing, and mental health issues. Some of these strategies may also be helpful in communicating with adults with disabilities. If you don't see the SAFE application on your phone, follow the instructions on this slide. Locate the Mobile Iron application on your state-issued cell phone. Select the Mobile Iron and it will check in. When Mobile Iron completes its check-in, your screen should look like the slide. Return to your phone's home screen. The SAFE application should appear on your iPhone in 5 to 15 minutes. If it does not appear, please power down your device and turn it back on. The SAFE icon should appear once you log back into your iPhone.
Lastly, There may be times that a client believes their rights have been violated. If they ask you who to contact, you can direct them to the Health and Human Services Commission Civil Rights Office. The contact information is located on this slide.
The developmental disability specialists are regional subject matter experts and liaisons when an infant, child, or youth is suspected or diagnosed with an intellectual and/or developmental disability. While their primary responsibility is intellectual and developmental disabilities, they may know of other community resources that are available in your area for youth and adults who have disabilities. If your regional DDS is not able to assist you, you may contact Dr. Kristen Jones at CPS State Office. Thank you for participating in this webinar today, and thank you for your continued dedication to the children and families that we serve.